The ceremony hall fell into suffocating silence as Alpha Caney Ashford's voice rolled through the space like thunder given form. Every wolf in the Moonridge pack felt their knees buckle, their necks crane downward in involuntary submission, their wolves whimpering inside their minds as the command Alpha crashed over them like a tidal wave of pure dominance. Caney stood at the center of the grand hall, his massive frame radiating authority, his silver eyes cold and calculating as he surveyed the sea of bowed heads before him. This was his favorite part of the monthly pack gathering, the moment when he reminded every single member exactly who held absolute power, who commanded their loyalty not through love or respect, but through the undeniable force of his alpha blood. His command was legendary throughout the territories, spoken of in hushed whispers as the most powerful anyone had witnessed in generations, capable of bringing even the strongest warriors to their knees with a single word, a single inflection of his will made manifest through sound. But then his eyes caught something impossible, something that made his blood run cold, despite the warmth of his dominance still pulsing through the room. There, near the back of the hall, stood a small Omega with tangled dark hair and eyes the color of storm clouds, her thin frame wrapped in a worn gray dress that hung loosely on her malnourished body. She was the only person still standing, while 300 wolves knelt in forced submission around her, while even his own beta and enforcers struggled against the weight of his command. This fragile-looking Omega stood perfectly straight, her expression not defiant, but simply neutral, as if his command had never reached her at all. Caney's jaw clenched so hard, he thought his teeth might crack. In 15 years of wielding his alpha authority, in countless battles and territorial disputes and challenges to his power, no one had ever remained standing when he issued a command. No one. The very idea was physically impossible, genetically contradictory to everything the pack dynamics represented. The crowd began to notice the anomaly, heads turning despite the command still pressing down on them, gasps and whispers rippling through the hall like wind through grass. Some wolves stared at the standing Omega with shock, others with something approaching horror, as if she had committed the ultimate blasphemy simply by existing outside the reach of their alphas. Control. Caney slowly released his command, allowing the pack members to rise, but his eyes never left the small Omega who had just shattered everything he understood about pack hierarchy and alpha dominance. As the wolves scrambled to their feet, creating distance from the strange Omega as if her resistance might be contagious, Caney heard the cruel laughter begin, the mocking voices that seemed to follow this girl wherever she went. Marcus, one of the pack's lead warriors, pointed at her with a sneer twisting his scarred face. His voice carried clearly through the hall, designed to humiliate. Of course the mute freak doesn't respond to commands. She probably didn't even hear it with whatever broken wiring she has in that defective head of hers. The laughter that followed was ugly and mean, the kind of laughter that comes from people desperate to distance themselves from anything that marks someone as different, as less than, as unworthy of pack protection. Several younger wolves began making exaggerated hand gestures, mocking sign language they didn't actually understand, their faces cruel with the particular viciousness that comes easily to those who have never known true powerlessness themselves. Even some of the older pack members, wolves who should have known better, who should have remembered that strength comes in many forms, joined in the mockery with knowing smirks and deliberately loud conversations about how embarrassing it must be for Beta Counselor Thorne to have produced such a disappointment of a daughter. Caney watched as the Omega, Sarah, he remembered her name, was from pack records he barely glanced at, kept her expression carefully blank, even as the mockery washed over her like acid rain. She had learned long ago that reacting only made it worse, that showing pain only encouraged the cruelty, that the only defense she had was to become stone, to let the words and laughter bounce off a shell she had carefully constructed over 23 years of relentless humiliation. But Caney saw something the others missed, perhaps because he was looking more carefully than they were, perhaps because he had spent so many years analyzing weakness to exploit it. He saw the slight tremor in her hands that she hid by clasping them behind her back, saw the way her breathing had become deliberately controlled, saw the muscle ticking in her jaw that spoke of teeth clenched against words that could never emerge anyway. She was not unaffected by the cruelty. She had simply become expert at hiding the wounds. What disturbed Caney far more than her emotional response, however, was the undeniable truth that she had stood unaffected while his command Alpha had crashed over everyone else like a tsunami. He was not a man who believed in coincidences or genetic flukes, and he certainly was not a man who accepted challenges to his authority with graceful understanding. If this Omega possessed some ability to resist Alpha commands, some quirk of biology or hidden power that allowed her to stand outside the fundamental laws of pack hierarchy, then she represented either an incredible weapon or an existential threat. And Caney had not built his reputation on leaving either weapons or threats in the hands of others. He descended from the raised platform where he had been standing, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet hall as pack members scrambled to clear a path, their earlier mockery dying in their throats as they recognized the particular quality of focus in their Alpha's eyes, the hunting intensity that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. Caney stopped directly in front of Sarah, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender soap she used, and the sharper scent of fear she was trying desperately to mask. Up close, he realized she was younger than he had initially thought, her face holding a delicate quality that malnutrition and stress had sharpened into something almost ethereal. Her storm gray eyes met his silver ones without flinching, not out of courage, he suspected, but out of years of practice at hiding, at becoming invisible even when physically present, at surviving in a pack that had decided long ago she was worth less than nothing. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the hall, every wolf straining to hear what their Alpha would do about this unprecedented situation. You will come to my residence immediately following this gathering. We have matters to discuss regarding your apparent immunity to Alpha commands. He had expected fear, perhaps panic, maybe even the desperate signing of protests or explanations. What he got instead was a slight nod of acknowledgement, her expression shifting not at all, as if being summoned to the Alpha's residence for interrogation was merely another indignity to be endured in a life already overflowing with them. Behind her, Caney saw her. Father, Beta Counselor Thorn, step forward with the particular expression of a man trying to distance himself from embarrassment. Thorn was a weasel of a man, politically savvy and morally flexible, exactly the kind of Beta who thrived in Kane's administration, through usefulness rather than actual loyalty. His voice reeked of false apology and barely concealed contempt for his own daughter, Alpha Caney. Please forgive this disruption. My daughter is unfortunately defective, born without the ability to speak or howl, likely brain damaged from birth. I assure you her standing during your command was not intentional disrespect, but simply the result of her inability to process pack dynamics properly. If you wish, I can have her removed from pack gatherings entirely to prevent future embarrassment. The casual cruelty of a father offering to further isolate his already marginalized daughter made even Caney pause, and he was a man not known for his sensitivity to the suffering of others. He had killed rivals without hesitation, had ordered punishments that left permanent scars, had built his power on a foundation of fear and absolute control. But there was something particularly pathetic about Thorn's eager betrayal of his own blood that turned Caney's stomach. Before he could respond, Sarah's hands moved in quick, sharp gestures, her fingers forming shapes that Caney did not understand, but that made her father's face flush with anger and embarrassment. Thorn grabbed her wrist, roughly, yanking her hands down with a hiss of fury barely kept below hearing range. Do not embarrass me further with your hand-waving nonsense. The Alpha does not have time for your dramatic displays. Caney found himself speaking, before he had consciously decided to intervene, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. Release her immediately, Beta Thorn. And in the future, remember that your daughter is a member of this pack, regardless of her perceived deficiencies, which makes her subject to my authority and my protection, not your personal shame to be discarded at convenience. The words surprised even Caney himself, as he had never particularly cared about the treatment of omegas beyond their utility to pack function, had in fact encouraged a hierarchy that placed them firmly at the bottom of the social structure. But something about the resigned acceptance in Sarah's eyes, the complete lack of surprise at her own father's betrayal, the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had fought invisible battles every single day of her existence, triggered something in him that he thought he had successfully killed years ago. Perhaps it was recognition of a fellow survivor of cruelty, or perhaps it was simply the tactical understanding that someone who could resist his commands deserved more careful study than casual dismissal. Thorne released Sarah's wrist immediately, stepping back with a bow that was more self-preservation than respect. The gathering dissolved shortly after, pack members filing out with backward glances at the strange Omega, who had defied their Alpha's command and lived, speculation already spreading like wildfire about what Caney planned to do with her. Sarah remained standing in the emptying hall, waiting with the patience of someone who had spent her entire life waiting for other people to decide her fate, her hands clasped loosely in front of her now, her breathing steady and controlled. When the last pack member had departed, and only Caney's personal guards remained at the exits, he gestured for her to follow him. Noting the slight hesitation before she complied, the way she maintained careful distance as they walked through the pack house corridors toward his private wing. His residence occupied the entire top floor of the pack house, a sprawling space of modern luxury and deliberate intimidation, all dark wood and steel and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the territory he ruled with an iron fist. Caney led Sarah into his study, a room dominated by a massive desk and walls lined with books on pack law, territorial treaties, and werewolf history that he had actually read, unlike most alphas who kept such libraries purely for show. He gestured to one of the chairs facing his desk, watching as she perched on the edge of it, like a bird ready to flee at the first sign of danger, her eyes tracking his movements with the wariness of prey in a predator's den. He did not sit, instead, moving to the windows and looking out over the territory while he organized his thoughts, deciding how to approach this unprecedented situation. Finally, he turned to face her, crossing his arms over his chest in a posture that was both casual and threatening, a reminder that despite his current curiosity, he was still the apex predator in this room and in this pack. I am going to ask you questions, and you are going to answer them. I do not care if you answer in sign language, written words, interpretive dance, or smoke signals, but you will answer, completely and honestly, or you will discover that my reputation for creative punishment is well earned. Do you understand? Sarah nodded once, her expression still carefully neutral, giving nothing away. Caney pulled a notepad and pen from his desk drawer, sliding them across the polished surface toward her. First question. Have you always been immune to alpha commands, or is this a recent development? Sarah picked up the pen with hands that trembled slightly, her handwriting small and precise as she wrote her response. I have never responded to alpha commands. I thought everyone knew I was defective. Caney read the words with growing interest, his mind already racing through the implications. If she had never responded to alpha commands, that meant this was not some new power she had developed, not some magical ability she had recently acquired, but rather something fundamental to her biology, something present from birth. He leaned against the edge of his desk, studying her with the intensity he usually reserved for battle strategy. And your family, your father, the pack leadership, they were all aware of this immunity? Sarah's pen moved again across the paper, her writing becoming slightly more rushed. They assumed I could not hear the commands because I am mute and likely brain damaged. No one ever considered I might be immune. They just thought I was too broken to respond properly. The sheer incompetence of the previous pack leadership astonished Caney, though perhaps it should not have, given how easily he had defeated the former Alpha and taken control of Moonridge. To have a pack member completely immune to Alpha authority, and to dismiss it as mere deficiency rather than investigating the cause or potential applications, was the kind of lazy thinking that got packs destroyed by more ambitious neighbors. He began pacing, a habit he had when thinking through complex problems. His movements, predatory and restless. I am going to test your immunity more thoroughly. I want to understand the limits of this ability. You will not be harmed, but you will cooperate fully. Understood? Another nod from Sarah, though this time he saw genuine fear flicker in her storm-gray eyes, quickly suppressed but present nonetheless. Caney moved to stand directly in front of her, close enough that his presence filled her entire field of vision, close enough that the power radiating from him should have made her wolf whimper in submission. He started with a simple command, the kind that even human pack members with weak wolf genetics could feel. Stand up. Nothing. Sarah remained seated, not in defiance but in complete lack of response, as if he had said nothing at all. He increased the power behind his next command, channeling his alpha authority in a way that would have had warriors twice her size scrambling to obey. I said stand up. Still nothing. Sarah sat perfectly still watching him, with those storm cloud eyes, waiting for whatever would come next. Caney felt frustration building in his chest, not at her specifically, but at the situation, at the fundamental wrongness of an Omega being able to ignore his direct commands as if they were merely suggestions. He spent the next hour testing every variation of command he could think of, from simple physical instructions to complex behavioral demands, from gentle suggestions backed by mild authority to full-force alpha dominance that should have overwhelmed any wolf's ability to resist. Nothing worked. Sarah sat through it all with that same patient acceptance, occasionally writing responses when he asked questions, her handwriting growing shakier as the session wore on, but her immunity remaining absolutely consistent. Finally, frustrated and mentally exhausted in a way he had not experienced in years, Caney slumped into his desk chair and stared at the small Omega who had just invalidated one of his primary tools of control. This is impossible. There is no werewolf genetics that produces immunity to alpha commands. It goes against everything we understand about pack hierarchy and dominance structures. Sarah reached for the notepad again, her writing slower now as fatigue caught up with her. Maybe I am not really a werewolf. Maybe I'm just broken in ways nobody has words for. The resignation in those written words, the complete acceptance of being fundamentally defective rather than potentially special, told Caney more about her life than hours of interrogation could have. This was a woman who had been told so many times that she was less than, broken, worthless, that she had internalized it completely, had built her entire identity around the idea that she was a mistake nature should never have made. It was pathetic and infuriating, and somehow made him angrier at the pack that had done this to her than at her for disrupting his worldview. He made a decision then, one that he would question many times in the months to come, but that felt tactically sound in the moment. You will move into the guest suite in this wing immediately. You will remain under my direct supervision until I understand exactly what you are and how your immunity works. This is not negotiable. This is not temporary. And this is not punishment. This is tactical necessity. If you can resist my commands, you can potentially resist any alpha's commands, which makes you either the most valuable Omega in the territories or the most dangerous. And I do not leave valuable or dangerous things uncontrolled. Sarah's eyes widened slightly, the first real emotion he had seen break through her careful mask, and her hand moved rapidly across the notepad. My father will be relieved to have me out of his house. When do you want me to move my things? Caney almost laughed at the practicality of her response, at the complete absence of protest or fear about being essentially imprisoned in the Alpha's residence, as if being held captive by the most feared Alpha in the region was merely a lateral move from her current living situation. Tonight, I will send guards to collect whatever belongings you have. In the meantime, I will have my housekeeper prepare your rooms and bring you dinner. You are dismissed to explore your new accommodations, but do not attempt to leave this wing without my explicit permission. The guards have orders to prevent your departure, by force if necessary. Sarah stood, gathering the notepad she had been writing on as if it might be taken from her, and moved toward the door with quick, quiet steps. Just before she exited, Caney called out to her, his voice softer than he had intended. Sarah, one more thing. In this wing, under my direct authority, you will not be mocked or mistreated for your silence. Anyone who attempts to do so will answer to me personally. That is not kindness. It is simply tactical management of a valuable asset. She turned back to look at him. And, for just a moment, he saw something flicker in her expression that might have been gratitude or might have been suspicion, that this was just another elaborate form of cruelty. Then she nodded once and left, closing the door quietly behind her, leaving Caney alone with his thoughts and the uncomfortable realization that in one evening, a silent Omega he had barely known existed had fundamentally challenged everything he understood about power, control, and the natural order of pack hierarchy. He poured himself a drink from the crystal decanter on his desk, staring out at the territory that bent to his will, and wondered what other impossible things this strange, damaged girl might be capable of, and whether discovering those capabilities would prove to be the best tactical decision he had ever made, or the mistake that would finally bring him down. If you are enjoying this story of hidden power and unexpected connection, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more supernatural romance content. Drop a comment below telling us what you think Sarah's immunity really means. Is she truly broken, or is she something far more powerful than anyone realizes? Let us know your theories. The weeks that followed Sarah's arrival in Caney's wing established a routine that was strange for both of them, a careful dance of observation and adaptation that neither had anticipated. Sarah occupied a guest suite 3 doors down from Caney's master bedroom, a space more luxurious than anywhere she had ever lived, with its own bathroom, sitting area, and windows that overlooked the forest rather than the parking lot her father's basement room had faced. Mrs. Chen, Caney's elderly housekeeper, had taken to Sarah immediately with a grandmother's instinct to feed anyone who looked half-starved, bringing meals 3 times a day and clucking disapprovingly at how Sarah's clothes hung on her thin frame. Caney observed these interactions with detached interest, noting how Sarah seemed more comfortable with the Omega housekeeper than with him, how she would occasionally smile at Mrs. Chen's fussing in a way she never smiled in his presence. Caney had assigned himself the task of learning sign language, approaching it with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to everything else. He purchased books, hired a tutor from a neighboring pack, practiced the hand shapes and movements until his fingers ached from the unfamiliar positions. It was purely tactical, he told himself, simply a necessary tool for communicating with an asset he needed to understand and control. It had nothing to do with the way Sarah's face had transformed the first time he had signed a clumsy good morning to her, the shock and wonder in her eyes suggesting that no one had ever bothered to learn her language before, that she had spent 23 years forcing herself to adapt to a world that refused to meet her halfway. Within 3 weeks, Caney could conduct basic conversations, and within 6 weeks, he was proficient enough to discuss complex topics, though Sarah still often chose to write when the ideas became too nuanced for his limited vocabulary. Their evening sessions became routine, Caney questioning her about her past, her experiences, her understanding of her own immunity, while simultaneously teaching her about pack politics, territorial disputes, the intricate web of alliances and enmities that governed werewolf society. He told himself it was simply information gathering, learning everything he could about her while preparing her to potentially serve as some kind of diplomatic tool or secret weapon. But there was something else happening in those quiet conversations, something neither of them wanted to name. Sarah was brilliant, he discovered, her mind sharp and analytical, in ways that her forced silence had hidden from everyone. She understood pack dynamics with a clarity that came from years of observation from the margins, from watching power plays, and social hierarchies from a position of enforced invisibility. Her insights were often uncomfortably accurate, cutting through political niceties to expose the raw motivations and fears that drove pack behavior. One evening, nearly 2 months after Sarah had moved into his wing, Caney was reading through territorial reports when her knock sounded at his study door, 3 soft taps that had become her signature. He gestured for her to enter, noting that she looked agitated in a way he had rarely seen. Her usual careful composure cracked around the edges. She moved to his desk and began signing rapidly, her hands moving so quickly that he had to ask her to slow down twice before he understood. There was a gathering happening in the pack common areas, a celebration for the warriors who had successfully defended the northern border against rogues. Sarah had gone down to observe, Curious about pack traditions she had never been invited to participate in before, and had been confronted by Marcus and several other senior wolves who had mocked her relentlessly, suggesting that she was Caney's pet freak, his personal oddity kept around for entertainment, implying with crude gestures exactly what services they thought a mute Omega might provide to their alpha. Caney felt rage ignite in his chest, hot and immediate, and more intense than the situation tactically warranted. He had explicitly stated that Sarah was under his protection, that mockery of her would not be tolerated. Yet these idiots had directly challenged his authority by tormenting her anyway. He stood abruptly, his movement so sudden that Sarah flinched backward, and he forced himself to pause, to moderate his body language so she would understand the anger was not directed at her. He signed slowly, making sure she understood every word. "Show me exactly who said these things to you. Take me to them now." Sarah's eyes widened and she shook her head frantically, signing that she had not told him to get anyone in. Trouble. That she had just been upset and needed to tell someone. That she did not want to cause problems. Caney signed back with deliberate precision. "They caused the problems when they ignored my direct order. You are merely reporting a violation of pack law. Now show me who disrespected my authority." They descended to the common areas together, Caney's presence causing immediate silence to fall over the gathered wolves, the party atmosphere evaporating like morning dew under harsh sunlight. Sarah pointed out Marcus and his 3 companions, all of whom suddenly looked far less confident than they had when tormenting a silent Omega they thought had no protection. Caney walked directly to Marcus, his expression calm in the way that made smart wolves start planning their escape routes. His voice, when he spoke, was conversational, almost pleasant, which made his words even more terrifying. "I am told you had some interesting theories about why I keep Sarah under my direct supervision. Would you care to share those theories with the entire pack? Or would you prefer to simply accept your punishment for directly defying my explicit orders regarding her treatment?" Marcus dropped to his knees immediately, his face pale, words tumbling out in a rush of apology and excuse. He had been drinking. He had not meant real disrespect. He had just been joking around like wolves do. Surely the alpha understood that Omegas needed thick skin to survive in pack dynamics. Caney let him finish, his pathetic justifications before responding with cold precision. "You and your companions will spend the next month on sanitation duty, cleaning every bathroom in the pack house, processing garbage, and maintaining the sewage systems. You will do this work in human form, without the assistance of pack resources. And you will be grateful I am feeling merciful today, because the alternative to this punishment is that I demonstrate on your bodies exactly why defying my orders is considered suicidal stupidity. Do you understand?" The 4 wolves practically fell over themselves agreeing, scrambling away as soon as Caney dismissed them, the party completely ruined now by the reminder that their alpha's mercy had very defined limits. When Caney turned back to Sarah, he found her staring at him with an expression he could not quite read, something between gratitude and discomfort, as if she did not know how to process someone defending her without expecting something in return. He signed simply, "I do not make empty threats. When I say you are under my protection, I mean it absolutely. No one in this pack touches you, mocks you, or disrespects you without answering to me. That is not kindness. That is pack law as I enforce it." Sarah's hands moved in response, her signing slower, more careful. "Why does it matter to you if they mock me? I am used to it. I do not need you to fight my battles." Caney considered his response carefully before signing back. "Perhaps I am tired of watching strong wolves waste their energy punching down at those they perceive as weaker. Perhaps I find it tactically inefficient and morally boring. Or perhaps I simply refuse to have my direct orders ignored because some idiot warrior thinks Omega suffering is acceptable entertainment." They returned to his wing in silence, but something had shifted between them, some invisible barrier lowering slightly. That night, for the first time, Sarah knocked on his study door not because she had information to share or questions to ask, but simply because she wanted company. They sat together in comfortable quiet, Caney reading territorial reports while Sarah curled up in the armchair by the window with one of his history books. The silence between them no longer awkward but almost peaceful. It became a pattern, these quiet evenings where they existed in the same space without expectation or performance, where Sarah's silence was not a deficiency to be overcome, but simply a different way of being present. Caney found himself watching her more than he tactically needed to, noticing small details that had nothing to do with her immunity to alpha commands. The way she tilted her head when she was thinking through complex ideas, the slight smile that appeared when she read something that amused her, the unconscious grace in her movements that suggested her wolf was stronger than her thin frame indicated. He caught himself wondering what her voice might sound like if she could speak, then dismissed the thought as pointless speculation. She was what she was, and he was beginning to suspect that her silence had shaped her into someone far more interesting than she might have been with conventional communication abilities. 3 months into her residency in his wing, Caney received an invitation that changed everything, a formal request from Alpha Dominic Thorne of the Western Coalition for a territorial summit to discuss trade agreements and border security. Normally, such summits were tedious political necessities that Caney endured with barely concealed impatience, but this one presented a unique opportunity. Dominic was known for having one of the most powerful Alpha commands in the territories, supposedly even stronger than Kane's own, capable of compelling submission through voice alone across vast distances. Caney had never tested himself against Dominic's power directly, and the tactical part of his mind that was always calculating advantages and vulnerabilities saw an opportunity too valuable to ignore. He brought the invitation to Sarah that evening, sliding the formal document across the table where she sat eating the dinner Mrs. Chen had prepared. She read it carefully, her expression growing troubled as she reached the details about Dominic's reputation and abilities. When she looked up at Caney, her hands moved in sharp, anxious gestures. "You want to take me there. You want to see if I can resist his command, too." Caney signed back, honestly, seeing no point in deception. "Yes. If you can resist Dominic's command the same way you resist mine, it confirms that your immunity is not specific to me, but rather absolute. That information is tactically valuable in ways you cannot imagine." Sarah's response was immediate and fearful. "And if I cannot resist his command? If whatever protects me from you does not work on him? What happens to me then?" It was a fair question, one that Caney had considered carefully before deciding to pursue this path. He signed his answer slowly, making sure she understood his commitment. "If his command affects you, we will know that your immunity has limits or conditions we need to understand better. But regardless of the outcome, you remain under my protection. I will not allow Dominic or anyone else to harm you or take you from my authority. You have my word on this. And I do not give my word lightly." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, looking for deception or hidden threats, and apparently finding neither, because she finally nodded her acceptance, though her hands trembled slightly as she signed her agreement to accompany him to the summit. The Western Coalition's territory was a 5-hour drive from Moonridge, taking them through some of the most beautiful wilderness in the region, dense forests giving way to mountain vistas that took Sarah's breath away, based on how she pressed against the car window to stare. Caney found himself explaining the geography, pointing out territorial boundaries and significant landmarks, enjoying the rare experience of seeing familiar landscapes through fresh eyes. Sarah had rarely left Moonridge territory, her father having deemed her too embarrassing to bring to Interpack events, so everything about this journey was new and wonder-inducing for her. Her excitement was infectious in a way Caney had not experienced before, making him remember what it had been like before cynicism and tactical calculation had consumed his worldview entirely. The summit itself was held in a grand lodge that Alpha Dominic had built specifically for diplomatic gatherings. All soaring timber beams and massive fireplaces, and carefully neutral decoration that offended no Pax aesthetic sensibilities. Dominic himself greeted them in the main hall, a massive man even by Alpha standards, easily 6'7" with shoulders that could barely fit through standard doorways, and a smile that never quite reached his calculating amber eyes. He clasped Caney's forearm in the traditional greeting between allied alphas, his grip just slightly too tight, a subtle dominance play that Caney matched with equal pressure, both men acknowledging the power game without verbally addressing it. Dominic's eyes slid to Sarah with obvious curiosity, taking in her small frame and downcast gaze with the particular interest of a predator spotting unusual prey. "And who is this lovely Omega you have brought to our summit, Caney? I do not believe we have met." Caney kept his voice carefully neutral, giving away nothing of Sarah's unique abilities or his real purpose in bringing her. "This is Sarah, a member of my pack who assists with certain administrative functions. I thought the diplomatic exposure would be educational for her." It was a reasonable cover story. Omega assistants sometimes accompanied their alphas to summits to take notes or manage scheduling, though Dominic's expression suggested he found something suspicious about Caney specifically, choosing to bring this particular Omega to this particular event. The first day of the summit passed in tedious negotiations over timber rights and hunting territory boundaries, the kind of minutia that made Caney's wolf pace restlessly in his mind, bored by the endless diplomatic dancing around simple resource allocation. Sarah sat quietly in the corner of the conference room, ostensibly taking notes, but actually observing the power dynamics and social interactions with the same analytical intensity Caney had come to expect from her. That evening, during the formal dinner, Dominic made his move, and Caney realized he had been waiting for exactly this opportunity all along. The Western Coalition Alpha stood at the head of the banquet table, raising his glass in what appeared to be a simple toast, but that carried undercurrents of dominance and testing that every alpha in the room immediately recognized. His voice rolled out across the gathered wolves, pleasant on the surface, but carrying the unmistakable weight of alpha command underneath. "To new alliances and old friendships, may we all bow to the strength of unity and the power of cooperation." It was clever, Caney had to admit, wrapping a command to bow inside toast language, making it seem like natural pack bonding rather than a blatant display of dominance. Every wolf in the room responded immediately, even the visiting alphas feeling the pull of Dominic's powerful command, bending forward in their seats in a gesture that honored the toast while simultaneously acknowledging Dominic's superior authority. Every wolf, except two. Caney remained upright through sheer force of will and the strength of his own alpha genetics, resisting Dominic's command with visible effort that made his jaw clench and his hands grip the table edge hard enough to leave finger-shaped dents in the wood. And Sarah, small silent Sarah sitting at the far end of the table, remained perfectly upright, sipping her wine with no indication that she had even felt Dominic's command, completely unaffected by power that had forced even visiting alphas into submission. The room went deathly silent as wolves slowly straightened, their eyes moving between Dominic, Caney, and the small Omega, who sat calmly amid the chaos her immunity had created. Dominic's amber eyes locked onto Sarah, with an intensity that made Caney's protective instincts flare hot and immediate. The Western Coalition Alpha moved around the table with predatory grace, stopping directly in front of Sarah's chair, looming over her with his massive frame in a deliberate intimidation tactic. His voice, when he spoke, carried dangerous curiosity and barely restrained aggression. Fascinating. The Omega appears to be either profoundly disrespectful or profoundly unusual. Which is it, little wolf? Are you defying me deliberately, or are you simply too broken to understand pack courtesy? Sarah looked up at him with those storm-gray eyes, her expression calm, despite the very real danger radiating from the alpha who could crush her with one hand, and reached for the small notepad she carried everywhere. Her handwriting was steady as she wrote her response and held it up for Dominic to read. "I apologize for any disrespect. I am mute and have difficulty with certain pack protocols. I meant no offense." It was a careful non-answer that explained nothing while appearing to explain everything. And Caney felt pride spark in his chest at her tactical thinking, her ability to deflect without lying or revealing the truth of her immunity. Dominic read the note with narrowed eyes, clearly unsatisfied with the explanation, but unable to directly challenge it without appearing to bully a disabled Omega in front of numerous witnesses. But Dominic had not built his power through giving up easily, and Caney saw the exact moment when the other alpha decided to push harder, to test exactly what this strange Omega could withstand. Dominic's voice dropped lower, taking on the particular resonance of full alpha command, the kind of dominance that should have overwhelmed any Omega's ability to resist, forced submission through the very genetic coding that made them pack creatures. "Stand up right now and bare your throat to me in submission." It was not a request. not even really a command in the traditional sense, but rather an invocation of the fundamental hierarchy that governed all werewolf interactions, the absolute authority of Alpha over Omega that existed at a level deeper than conscious thought. Sarah remained seated, her hands folded calmly in her lap, her throat covered by the high collar of her dress, completely unaffected by Dominic's command. Around the room, other Omegas whimpered in sympathetic response to the Alpha power being directed at Sarah, their own wolves responding to dominance that was not even targeted at them. But Sarah herself showed no reaction whatsoever. Dominic's face flushed with anger and confusion, his Alpha pride wounded by this unprecedented resistance. And Caney saw his hand move toward Sarah's shoulder, saw the intent to physically force her compliance, and moved before conscious thought could intervene. He was across the room in 3 long strides, his own Alpha authority flaring to life as he put himself between Dominic and Sarah, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "She is under my direct protection, Dominic. You will not touch her without my explicit permission, which you will never receive. If you have concerns about her behavior, you address them to me as her Alpha, not to her directly." Dominic's eyes snapped to Caney, amber meeting silver in a clash of wills that had nothing to do with alliances or trade agreements, and everything to do with 2 apex predators establishing exactly where the lines of acceptable behavior existed. The Western Coalition Alpha's voice was tight with barely controlled fury. "Your Omega is either defying direct Alpha commands or possesses some ability that makes her extremely valuable or extremely dangerous. Either way, I have a right to understand what is happening in my own territory." Caney's response was cold and absolute. "You have a right to nothing regarding members of my pack beyond basic diplomatic courtesy. Sarah's abilities or lack thereof are my concern, not yours. If you attempt to command her, touch her, or investigate her without my approval again, we will have a much more serious conversation about boundaries and consequences." The standoff lasted for heartbeats that felt like hours, both Alphas radiating enough dominance to make the lesser wolves in the room press back against the walls, desperate to escape the crossfire of that much concentrated power. Finally, Dominic stepped back with a forced smile that fooled no one. "Of course, Caney. I meant no disrespect to your authority over your own pack members. I was simply surprised by such unusual behavior. Perhaps we should continue this summit another time, when tempers are less volatile." It was a dismissal wrapped in diplomatic language, an ending to the summit that allowed Dominic to save face while getting the unwelcome guests out of his territory. And Caney accepted it with equal false courtesy, knowing they had just fundamentally damaged the alliance while simultaneously confirming exactly what he had come to learn. The drive back to Moonridge territory was quiet until they were safely past the border. Markers. And then Sarah's hands began moving in frantic signs, her composure finally cracking under the stress of the evening. She had thought Dominic might hurt her, had been terrified when he commanded her to submit, had felt his rage when she remained unaffected, and had been sure that Caney would let Dominic do whatever he wanted, because maintaining political alliances was more important than protecting one defective Omega. Caney pulled the car over to the side of the road, turning to face her fully so she could see his hands as he signed his response. "I will never sacrifice you for political convenience. I told you that you were under my protection, and I meant it absolutely. Dominic could have offered me control of half the Western territories, and I still would not have let him touch you. Do you understand this?" Sarah stared at him with those storm-gray eyes that were suddenly bright with unshed tears, and her hands moved in a sign he had taught her weeks ago, but that she had never used until this moment, the sign for thank you, repeated over and over until Caney caught her hands gently in his own, stilling their frantic movement. They sat there in the stopped car on a dark forest road, Alpha and Omega, predator and prey, 2 people who should never have found common ground, but who had somehow built something fragile and real in the spaces between words and commands. Caney felt something crack in his chest, some wall he had carefully constructed around anything, resembling genuine emotion, and he made a decision that would change everything between them. He signed slowly, making sure she saw every word. "I need to tell you something about your immunity, something I have been researching since you first came to live in my wing. I believe I know what you are, and if I am right, You are not defective or broken. You are something our people thought was extinct, something so rare that most modern wolves believe it is only legend. Sarah's eyes widened. Her attention absolutely focused on his signing hands. Caney continued, years of research condensing into explanation. There are ancient texts that speak of omegas born once every 1,000 years, with an ability called the silent voice, a power that operates on frequencies that alpha commands cannot penetrate, because it exists outside the normal pack hierarchy entirely. These omegas were considered sacred guardians, protectors who could stand against tyrannical alphas, whose very existence ensured that no alpha could become so powerful that they destroyed the balance of pack dynamics. His hands kept moving, translating complex history into signs that felt inadequate to the magnitude of what he was explaining. Silent voice omegas were said to communicate through bonds deeper than speech, to understand pack dynamics at a level that allowed them to heal rifts no alpha command could fix, to stand as witnesses to truth in situations where power might otherwise obscure reality. They were not broken, Sarah. They were sacred, and they were systematically hunted to extinction nearly 800 years ago by a coalition of alphas who saw them as threats to absolute power rather than necessary balance. Sarah's hands trembled as she signed her question. If they were all killed, how can I be one? How can I have this power if it died out centuries ago? Caney signed his theory, the conclusion he had reached after months of study and observation. Genetic traits that profound do not simply disappear. They go dormant, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to re-emerge. You are not broken, Sarah. You are a genetic miracle, the return of something our people desperately need, even if they do not realize it yet. Your silence is not a disability. It is the price of power so profound that it operates beyond normal werewolf communication entirely. He watched the information settle over her, watched understanding and disbelief war in her expression, watched years of internalized worthlessness begin to crack under the weight of a completely different narrative about her existence. Her hands moved slowly, carefully, signing words that carried the weight of every cruel comment, every mocking laugh, every moment of isolation she had endured. If this is true, if I am this sacred thing, why did no one recognize it? Why did my own father call me defective? Why did the pack treat me like garbage for 23 years? Caney's response was honest and brutal. Because our people have forgotten their own history. Because we have spent so many generations focused on alpha strength and dominance hierarchies that we have lost the ability to recognize power that looks different from raw physical force. Because your father is an idiot who cannot see value unless it comes with fangs and volume. You were a miracle hiding in plain sight, and everyone was too busy looking for conventional strength to notice. They sat in that stopped car until dawn light began, filtering through the trees, Caney explaining everything he had learned about silent voice omegas, while Sarah absorbed information that fundamentally rewrote her understanding of her own identity. By the time they continued the drive back to Moonridge, something had shifted irrevocably between them, some connection forming that went beyond alpha and pack member, beyond protector and protected, beyond even the growing friendship they had been carefully building. Caney had given Sarah the gift of understanding that she was not broken, and Sarah had given Caney the gift of purpose beyond simple dominance, the realization that protecting her power and helping her understand it might be the most important thing he ever accomplished as an alpha. What neither of them realized yet, what would only become clear in the challenging months ahead, was that Sarah's silent voice carried capabilities far beyond simple immunity to alpha commands, powers that could reshape pack dynamics entirely if she could learn to wield them intentionally, and that those powers would soon be desperately needed as threats emerged, that alpha strength alone could never defeat. But for now, in the quiet dawn light, filtering through pine trees as they drove toward home, it was enough to have found understanding, to have discovered that the strange bond forming between them was not weakness or distraction, but rather the beginning of something that might save them both from the lonely isolation their respective powers had created in their lives. Thank you so much for watching. If this story resonates with you, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next in Sarah and Caney's journey. Comment below. and tell us what power do you think Sarah's silent voice will reveal next. Your engagement helps us create more content like this. The revelation about silent voice omegas changed everything, and nothing simultaneously in the weeks that followed their return from the disastrous summit. With Dominic. Outwardly, their routine remained similar, with Sarah still residing in Caney's wing, still joining him for evening discussions in his study, still existing in the careful balance of protection and observation that had defined their relationship since she first moved in. But, internally, fundamentally, the dynamic between them had transformed in ways neither was quite ready to name or examine too closely. Caney found himself watching Sarah not with the analytical distance of someone, studying a tactical asset but with something closer to wonder, seeing her quiet grace and careful observations as manifestations of power rather than adaptations to disability. And Sarah, for perhaps the first time in her life, began to hold herself differently, to meet people's eyes instead of staring at the ground, to occupy space as if she had a right to exist, rather than as if she was perpetually apologizing for taking up room in a world that had made clear it had no place for her. Caney threw himself into research with obsessive intensity, spending hours in the PAC's archives and reaching out to scholarly contacts in other territories to learn everything possible about silent voice omegas and their historical role in PAC dynamics. What he discovered was both fascinating and deeply disturbing, painting a picture of power so profound that they had threatened the very foundation of alpha-dominated PAC structures. Silent voice omegas had not simply been immune to commands. They had been able to nullify alpha authority entirely within certain ranges, creating zones of free will where PAC members could make decisions without the weight of dominance hierarchy influencing their choices. They had served as mediators in PAC disputes, as advisors who could speak truth to power without fear of compulsion, as healers who could soothe PAC bonds damaged by trauma or conflict. But most significantly, and most dangerously from the perspective of power-hungry alphas, silent voice. Omegas had been able to break forced bonds, to sever connections created through command rather than genuine consent, to free wolves from alpha control that had become tyrannical or abusive. This ability had made them existential threats to alphas who ruled through fear and forced submission, leading to the systematic hunt that had supposedly eliminated the trait from werewolf genetics 8 centuries ago. Caney presented this information to Sarah one evening in his study, signing the history with hands that trembled slightly as the implication sank in fully. If she truly carried this power, if she could learn to wield it intentionally rather than passively, she could fundamentally reshape PAC dynamics not just in Moonridge, but potentially across all the territories. Sarah's response, signed with that careful precision he had come to recognize as her thinking deeply about complex problems, cut straight to the heart of the matter. If these omegas were killed for being threats to alpha power, and you are an alpha who built your authority on absolute control, why are you helping me understand what I am? Why are you not afraid I will use this against you? Caney met her eyes steadily, his response honest in a way that surprised even himself. Because I am beginning to suspect that the kind of power I have built, the fear-based dominance I have used to control this PAC, is not actually strength, but rather a weakness I have been too proud to acknowledge. And because having seen what you can do, having felt my own commands fail against your immunity, I find I am less afraid of losing control than I am curious about what a PAC could become if it was not held together solely by force. It was perhaps the most vulnerable thing Caney had admitted to anyone in his entire adult life. This acknowledgement that his approach to leadership might be fundamentally flawed, that strength might look different than he had always believed. Sarah stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for deception or manipulation, and apparently finding neither because her hands moved in signs that carried their own weight of vulnerability. I do not know how to be this sacred, powerful thing you think I am. I have spent my entire life being the PAC's biggest failure, learning to make myself small and invisible, surviving through silence that was forced rather than chosen. I do not know how to be anything else. Caney's response was immediate and certain. Then we will learn together. I will help you discover the full extent of your abilities, and you will teach me what leadership looks like when it is not based on fear and forced submission. We will figure this out as partners, not as alpha and omega, not as protector and protected, but as equals working toward something neither of us fully understands yet. The word equals hung in the air between them, radical and dangerous and thrilling in ways neither wanted to examine too closely. Alphas did not have equals, especially not omega equals, especially not in the context of pack leadership and power dynamics. But Caney found he meant it absolutely. Found that somewhere in the months of learning her language and observing her brilliant mind and watching her navigate a world designed to diminish her, he had come to see Sarah as fundamentally his equal in ways that had nothing to do with genetic hierarchy, and everything to do with the qualities he actually valued, intelligence and resilience, and the particular courage required to remain kind when the world had given you every reason to become bitter. They began experimenting with Sarah's abilities in controlled settings, starting with simple exercises and building toward more complex applications of her power. Caney would issue commands of varying intensity, while Sarah focused on her immunity, trying to understand the mechanism that allowed her to resist, rather than simply accepting it as automatic. What they discovered was that her immunity was not actually passive, but rather an active power that operated below her conscious awareness, a shield that activated automatically whenever Alpha authority targeted her, but that she could potentially learn to extend or manipulate with practice. The breakthrough came one evening when Caney commanded a simple object to be moved while Sarah was touching it, and the object remained still, her immunity somehow extending to protect even inanimate things from Alpha will when they fell within her. Direct influence. This discovery opened up possibilities that both excited and terrified them. Implications that if Sarah could extend her immunity beyond herself, she might be able to shield other pack members from commands, might be able to create spaces of true autonomy within the rigid hierarchy of pack structure. Caney's tactical mind immediately saw the applications for interrogation, for protecting pack members from enemy Alpha manipulation, for creating safe spaces for wolves who needed to recover from command-based trauma. But more than the tactical advantages, he found himself imagining a pack where authority was earned through leadership and wisdom, rather than enforced through genetic dominance, where pack members chose to follow because they respected their Alpha, rather than because they had no choice but to submit. It was a radical vision, one that went against everything he had been taught about pack leadership, everything he had built his own power on, and yet Caney found himself unable to let go of the idea once it had taken root in his mind. Sarah was changing him in ways he had not anticipated, challenging assumptions he had not even realized he held, making him question whether the strength he had always prided himself on was actually just another form of weakness. Control, masquerading as confidence, dominance, covering insecurity about whether anyone would choose to follow him if they had the freedom to walk away. Their evening sessions evolved from clinical experimentation to deeper conversations about pack structure, about the nature of power and authority, about what it meant to lead versus what it meant to dominate. Sarah had insights born from years of observing pack dynamics from the outside, seeing patterns and problems that those within the hierarchy were too invested in the system to recognize. She signed to him about the Omegas she had watched become shells of themselves under constant command pressure, about the warriors who followed orders they morally objected to because Alpha authority overrode their personal ethics, about the slow erosion of individual agency that occurred when every decision could be overridden by a more dominant will. Caney listened to these observations with growing discomfort, recognizing his own leadership reflected in behaviors Sarah described as harmful, seeing himself in the Alphas who used command as a first resort rather than a last option. It would have been easy to become defensive, to argue that strength required firm control, that packs needed clear hierarchy to function effectively. But Sarah's presence made such arguments feel hollow, her very existence proof that immunity to Alpha authority did not automatically create chaos or weaken pack bonds, that autonomy and community could coexist if leadership was willing to earn loyalty rather than simply command it. The pack began to notice changes in their Alpha, subtle shifts in how he approached leadership and decision, making that rippled through the community like stones dropped in still water. Caney started asking for input before making major decisions, actually listening to objections and alternative suggestions, rather than simply imposing his will. He reduced his use of alpha commands to genuine emergencies, rather than casual enforcement of preferences, allowing pack members to make their own choices about minor matters, even when those choices differed from what he would have commanded. The response was mixed, some wolves appreciating the increased autonomy, while others found it unsettling, uncomfortable with freedom, after years of operating under strict dominance hierarchy. Beta Thorn was among those most disturbed by the changes, approaching Caney one afternoon with barely concealed anxiety twisting his weasel features. His voice carried the particular tone of someone trying to alert a superior to danger while avoiding directly criticizing their judgment. Alpha Caney, pack members are beginning to question whether your association with my daughter has weakened your resolve. There are concerns that allowing her presence to influence your leadership decisions shows dangerous softness that our enemies might exploit. Caney regarded his beta with cold assessment, recognizing the veiled attack on Sarah wrapped in concern for pack welfare. His response was measured but carried an edge that made Thorn's face pale. What I hear you saying, Beta Thorn, is that you are uncomfortable with leadership that does not rely solely on fear and forced compliance. What I hear is that you benefited from a system where your political maneuvering could flourish in the shadow of my dominance, and you are worried that a more engaged, less command-dependent approach to pack leadership might expose your lack of actual value beyond enabling my worst impulses. Thorn stammered protests, but Caney cut him off with a gesture. Your daughter has shown me that strength comes in many forms, that power wielded without wisdom is just brutality dressed up as authority, and that the mark of a truly strong pack is not how thoroughly the alpha can dominate every member, but rather how effectively members can work together toward shared goals, even when they disagree about methods. If you find this approach weak, you are welcome to challenge for beta position or request transfer to another pack. But you are not welcome to continue undermining Sarah's influence on my leadership simply because you are too small-minded to recognize her value. It was the closest Caney had come to publicly acknowledging how profoundly Sarah had impacted his worldview. And Thorn retreated with visible shock at this defense of the daughter he had spent 23 years denigrating and dismissing. That evening, when Caney relayed the conversation to Sarah, her hands moved in signs that combined pride and concern. She was glad he had defended her, grateful that he saw her influence as positive rather than threatening, but worried that he was damaging his authority for her sake, creating vulnerabilities that enemies might exploit. Caney's response was firm, signed with absolute conviction. Any authority that cannot withstand evolution, that collapses when challenged to be better, is not actually strength, but rather fragility disguised as power. You are not weakening me, Sarah. You are helping me become the kind of alpha this pack deserves, even if they do not realize it yet. That is worth whatever political cost comes with it. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither wanted to name, the careful distance they had maintained beginning to feel more like a barrier than a protection. Caney found himself noticing details that had nothing to do with tactical assessment or power dynamics. The way lamplight caught in Sarah's dark hair, the precise geometry of her delicate features, the grace in her signing hands that spoke of unconscious elegance rather than learned performance. He had started thinking of her not as the silent Omega under his protection, but simply as Sarah, as the most interesting person he had encountered in years, as someone whose presence had become essential to his daily existence in ways that had nothing to do with her immunity to commands or her potential as a tactical asset. And Sarah, for her part, found herself watching Caney with similar attention, seeing past the feared alpha to the complicated man underneath, someone capable of tremendous gentleness despite his reputation for brutality, someone willing to question everything he had built in pursuit of something better, someone who had learned her language and defended her worth, and looked at her like she mattered in ways that had nothing to do with ancient powers or sacred purposes. It was dangerous, this growing connection between them, complicated by power dynamics and pack politics, and the fundamental inequality built into alpha-omega relationships. But it was also undeniable, building in the quiet spaces of evening conversations and shared research and moments when their hands touched while signing and neither pulled away as quickly as they should have. The turning point came during a crisis that neither had anticipated, an emergency that would test both Sarah's powers and the bond growing between them in ways that would leave no room for pretending their relationship was purely professional or tactical. A messenger arrived in the middle of the night, frantic with news that rogue wolves had taken hostages on the northern border, demanding territory concessions and safe passage in exchange for the captured pack members. The rogues were led by a former alpha named Garrett, who had been exiled from his own pack for excessive brutality, a wolf known for using command to torture and break those under his control, whose signature move was forcing wolves to harm themselves or each other through alpha authority, while he watched for entertainment. Caney immediately mobilized his warriors, but the situation was complicated by Garrett's demand that Caney come personally to negotiate, alone and unarmed, or the hostages would be executed one by one until his conditions were met. It was obviously a trap, an attempt to eliminate Caney while he was vulnerable and take over Moonridge Pack in the resulting chaos. But leaving pack members to die was not an option Caney could accept, not when he had spent months trying to build a pack based on genuine care, rather than just domination. He was preparing to leave when Sarah appeared in his tactical room, her expression determined in a way he had rarely seen, her hands moving in signs that brooked no argument. "I am coming with you. My immunity to commands means I can function where you cannot. You need me for this." Caney's immediate instinct was to refuse, to command her to stay safe in the pack house where nothing could threaten her. But he caught himself before the words could form, remembering his commitment to treating her as an equal, to respecting her agency even when every protective instinct screamed against it. His hands moved in signs that combined worry and acknowledgement. "This will be extremely dangerous. Garrett is unpredictable and sadistic. If he realizes what you are, what you can do, he will try to kill you, or capture you to use against other alphas. I cannot guarantee your safety." Sarah's response was simple and devastating. "You have never been able to guarantee my safety. Not really. Not in a world where being different makes you a target. But together, we have a chance to save those hostages that neither of us has alone. So we go together, as partners, or we both stay here and live with the guilt of choosing safety over doing what is right." They took a small team of Caney's most trusted warriors, traveling to the northern border where Garrett waited with his rogues, and the 5 captured pack members, all of whom showed signs of rough treatment and terror. Garrett himself was a hulking brute of an alpha, all crude strength and malicious cunning, his scarred face twisted into a mockery of welcome as Caney and Sarah approached under flag of truce. His voice carried the particular sliminess of someone who enjoyed others' suffering. "Well, well, the great Alpha Caney finally shows his face. And he brought a little Omega snack for the road. How generous." His eyes traveled over Sarah with obvious intent that made Caney's blood boil. But before he could respond, Garrett's expression shifted to confusion, as he seemed to recognize something about her. "Wait, you are the mute Omega from Moonridge. I heard about you from some of my boys who used to run with your pack. They said you were defective, useless, that your own father was ashamed of you. Why would Caney bring damaged goods to a negotiation?" Sarah's hands moved in signs that Garrett could not read, but Caney translated, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "She says that she is here because she has abilities you do not understand, and because underestimating her based on your assumptions about what strength looks like is a mistake you will regret." Garrett laughed, a ugly sound that held no genuine humor, and Caney felt the Alpha's power gather like a storm about to break. "Let us test that theory. All of you, including the little mute Omega, kneel before me now." The command crashed out with devastating force, powerful enough that Caney's own warriors struggled against it, dropping to their knees with gritted teeth and angry shame at being so thoroughly dominated. Caney remained standing through sheer will, his alpha strength matching Garrett's just barely, the effort showing in the tension of every muscle and the sweat beading on his forehead. But Sarah stood perfectly relaxed, completely unaffected, and the shock on Garrett's face was almost comical as he realized this small Omega had not even felt his command, had not struggled or fought but simply existed outside his power entirely. He tried again, pouring more dominance into his voice. commanding her to submit, to bare her throat, to crawl to him and beg for mercy, each command more desperate and furious than the last. And Sarah stood through all of it, her storm-gray eyes locked on Garrett with an intensity that made the rogue alpha take an involuntary step backward, finally understanding that he faced something he had no experience dealing with, something that made his primary weapon useless. What happened next shocked everyone, including Sarah herself. As Garrett reached for the nearest hostage, clearly planning to kill one to reassert control over the situation, Sarah moved forward and placed her hand on the terrified Omega's shoulder. Immediately, visibly, the hostage's expression changed from terror to something approaching calm, and when Garrett screamed a command for the hostage to remain still while he slit her throat, the Omega moved away smoothly. Sarah's touch, apparently extending her immunity to protect the other wolf from Garrett's command. Caney saw understanding and fear flash across Garrett's face simultaneously. The rogue alpha, realizing that this small, silent Omega could nullify everything he was, could make his power meaningless, could expose him as just a brutal thug without the alpha authority to enforce his will. Garrett lunged for Sarah with claws extended, clearly planning to kill what he could not control, but Caney intercepted him with a Y, force that sent both alphas tumbling across the forest floor in a tangle of violence and dominance. The fight was brutal and brief, Caney's fury at the threat to Sarah lending his strikes devastating power, and within minutes Garrett lay defeated, throat torn and life bleeding into the pine needles while his rogues scattered into the forest without their alpha to force their loyalty. Caney stood over the body, chest heaving, looking more wolf than man in that moment, and turned to find Sarah. Standing with all 5 hostages gathered around her hands on their shoulders in a protective circle, her power shielding them from any residual commands in the air, her expression combining shock at what she had done with quiet pride at having saved lives that would have been lost without her intervention. The ride back to pack territory was quiet, everyone processing what they had witnessed. The tactical implications of an Omega, who could extend immunity to others fundamentally changing, how they understood pack dynamics and combat strategy. But Caney could think of nothing except how close Sarah had come to death, how Garrett's claws had been inches from her throat, how he had felt something crack in his chest at the thought of losing her. When they finally reached his private wing, when the hostages had been treated, and the warriors dismissed and only the 2 of them remained, Caney turned to Sarah with hands that trembled slightly as he signed words he had never expected to say, to anyone. When I saw him lunge for you, when I thought I might lose you, I realized that you have become more important to me than tactical advantage or political strategy, or any of the reasons I initially told myself I was keeping you close. I need you to understand that what I feel is not about your power or your immunity or your sacred purpose. It is about you, Sarah, about who you are when all those other things are stripped away. Sarah's eyes widened, her breathing becoming unsteady, and her hands moved in response that carried equal vulnerability. I have spent my whole life being the Omega no one wanted, the defective daughter, the pack's biggest embarrassment, and then you looked at me like I was worth learning a new language for, worth defending against other alphas, worth trusting as an equal. You have given me the first real home I have ever had, not a place but a person who sees me as something other than broken. How could I not fall in love with that? With you, even. Knowing how complicated and dangerous and probably foolish it is? The word love hung between them, terrifying and thrilling, and Caney closed the distance between them in 2 strides, framing Sarah's face with hands that had dealt death just hours ago, but that held her now with exquisite gentleness. Their first kiss was soft and questioning, both of them half expecting some fundamental law of pack dynamics to intervene, some genetic imperative that would make alpha-omega intimacy impossible, or wrong. But the only thing Caney felt was rightness. The sense of puzzle pieces fitting together that he had never known were missing. The understanding that this strange, brilliant, damaged Omega was exactly who he had been unconsciously searching for through years of empty dominance and forced submission and leadership that satisfied his pride, but left his soul feeling hollow. They made love that night with a tenderness that surprised them both, Caney treating Sarah's body like sacred territory to be explored with reverence rather than conquered. Sarah touching him without the fear that had colored every other intimate interaction in her life. Both of them discovering that vulnerability shared willingly created connection that dominance could never force. Afterward, lying tangled together in sheets that smelled of them both, Sarah's head resting on Kane's chest where she could feel his heartbeat steady under her ear, Kaney signed into the darkness the truth he had been avoiding for months. You are my mate. Not because destiny demanded it, not because of marking or bonds or pack tradition, but because I choose you and you choose me. And that choice means more than any forced connection ever could. Sarah signed back against his chest, her fingers tracing letters on his skin. I choose you too. Every day, every moment. I choose this difficult, impossible, wonderful thing we are building together. And in that moment, in the quiet aftermath of violence and confession and connection, neither of them knew that the real challenges were still ahead, that the pack would struggle with accepting an Omega as their alpha's equal partner, that other alphas would see Sarah as threat to be eliminated, that her powers would grow in ways that would force them both to reconsider everything they thought they understood about pack dynamics and mate bonds and the nature of strength itself. But those battles were for tomorrow. Tonight, they had each other. They had chosen each other freely, and that was enough. The epilogue to Sarah and Kaney's story unfolded over months and years, a gradual transformation of not just their relationship, but of Moonridge Pack itself. Sarah never gained the ability to speak verbally, her silence remaining constant, but she found her true voice in other ways, through the sign language that an increasing number of pack members learned to communicate with her, through the written words that shaped new pack policies and reforms, through the quiet strength of presence that made her opinion valued, even without volume. She became Kaney's official partner in leadership, not Luna in the traditional sense, but something new, a role they created together that recognized her sacred purpose as Silent Voice Omega, while acknowledging the genuine love and respect that formed the foundation of their bond. Together, they rebuilt pack structure to balance hierarchy with autonomy, using Sarah's immunity and Kaney's authority to create spaces where pack members could choose rather than simply obey, where strength was measured by wisdom and compassion, as well as dominance and power. It was messy and complicated, and sometimes failed spectacularly, but it was also alive in ways the old rigid system had never been. PAX members bringing creativity and initiative and genuine loyalty to a community they felt invested in, rather than just controlled by. Other PAX watched with suspicion and growing interest as Moonridge thrived under this new model. Some, alphas seeing it as dangerous weakness, while others quietly reached out to learn how they might implement similar reforms in their own territories. Sarah's powers continued to develop, her ability to extend immunity becoming more refined and intentional, allowing her to shield entire groups from command or to create temporary zones of absolute autonomy where even the strongest alpha authority could not penetrate. She used these abilities sparingly and thoughtfully, understanding that true change came not from replacing one form of control with another, but from teaching wolves to trust their own judgment and make decisions from wisdom rather than fear. She became a sought-after mediator for inter-pack disputes, her immunity allowing her to hear all sides without being swayed by alpha dominance or political pressure, her judgments carrying weight precisely because everyone knew she could not be commanded to favor one party over another. Kaney never stopped learning from her, never stopped questioning his own impulses toward dominance and control, never stopped choosing partnership over pride. He remained a strong alpha, powerful and respected, but his strength manifested differently now, through earned loyalty rather than forced submission, through wisdom that acknowledged limitations rather than arrogance that denied them. Their love deepened over years of shared challenges and quiet moments, the bond between them growing stronger precisely because it was chosen freely every day, rather than enforced by genetics or destiny. When they finally performed a formal mating ceremony, it was not the traditional ritual of alpha claiming Omega, but something new they created together, a public declaration of chosen partnership between equals, witnessed by a pack that had learned to see strength in new forms and to value authenticity over tradition. Sarah signed her vows in the language Kaney had learned for her, and Caney spoke his promises in words everyone could hear, and the pack howled their approval not because they were commanded to, but because they genuinely celebrated two wolves who had found each other against all odds and in defiance of every social expectation. And sometimes, in quiet moments when it was just the two of them, when Sarah rested her head on Caney's shoulder and signed against his skin about her day, or her thoughts, or simply her love for him, Caney would remember the mocking ceremony where she first stood immune to his command, where everyone had called her defective and broken and worthless. He would remember thinking she was a tactical asset to be studied and controlled. Remember the moment that calculation had shifted into something far more profound. Remember learning that the most sacred thing he would ever protect was not territory or power or pride, but rather the strange silent Omega who had taught him that true strength looked like choosing gentleness, that real power came from earned trust, and that the deepest connections formed not through commands that forced compliance, but through understanding that allowed choice. The pack that had once mocked the silent Omega learned to treasure her wisdom. The Alpha who had ruled through fear learned to lead through love, and the two wolves who should never have fit together created something entirely new, a partnership that honored both strength and gentleness, dominance and autonomy, tradition and innovation. They built a legacy not of perfect harmony, but of honest struggle toward something better. A pack where silence could speak truth to power, where immunity to commands meant freedom to choose, and where the most defective Omega became the most sacred presence, not despite her differences, but because of them. Their story became legend in its own right, told and retold across territories, inspiring other Alphas and Omegas to question the rigid hierarchies they had always accepted as natural and inevitable. Some versions exaggerated Sarah's powers or romanticized their connection, but the core truth remained constant, that genuine strength came from partnership, that sacred purpose revealed itself in unexpected forms, and that love freely chosen would always be more powerful than bonds forced through command or circumstance. And in the quiet moments between leading and loving and building something better than what they had inherited, Sarah and Caney knew they had found what so many searched lifetimes for and never discovered: the profound, simple truth that being seen fully and chosen completely was the real magic, the actual miracle, the only power that truly mattered when everything else was stripped away.